But 95% of the time somebody calls me, it's like, Rob, they didn't pay me, or they want the money back. Okay. So in short, 95% of the problems that I see with contracts or the operations of a company dealing with clients is money. Uno, dos, tres.
So this is amazing, because I think as creatives, as people who enter the creative space, tax, legal, maybe some like hardcore business topics may not be their strong suit, right? Has that been your experience as well in reviewing contracts and things from creatives?
Correct. So it typically, I don't know, I'm not the scientist or the biologist, but you got one side of the brain that can draw the picture. You got the other side of the brain that can analyze the picture. And typically only a rare breed has both sides of that brain. So yes, I mean, typically my clients are thinking about how to take a better picture, how to plan a better event, and not necessarily, okay, well, should I be an LLC? Should I S corp the LLC in terms of tax purposes, these type of things. So yes, and typically in my experience, and this is a lot of experience with human beings, that when we don't understand something, we either fear it or run from it, right? We don't usually fight it. So a lot of times people come to me and, it'll be like a little folded piece of notebook paper with maybe some gum stuck to it, and that's their contract. So if you actually have a contract, you're doing probably better than a lot of creative professionals out there just starting in the game. So yeah, that's kind of my experience. You're absolutely right. There are certain industries that tend to draw a certain person, and the wedding and event space typically draws creative people that might not necessarily like math and might not necessarily like legal stuff.
Absolutely. And at the same time, we have such an exposure to possible lawsuits. There's such an exposure to a bunch of different areas. How do you help your clients? Kind of what's your first process, your first step as you start working with people?
So there's a lot of different buckets with regard to running running legally legit a wedding or event business. And so what I mean by buckets is there is intellectual property buckets. So okay, let me trademark my brand's logo, or trademark the image, or whatever it takes, the branding process. There is the component of what I would call operations or systems, which is the corporation, the liability component, LLC versus LLP. Do I need to have an operating agreement between me and my partner? Then there is the component of the actual interactions with you and other people or other companies, and that's kind of the contractual component. So the contract that you sign or have your client sign, that's a different animal altogether. Then there's the employee side or the independent contractor side. So there's a lot of buckets when you're dealing with a wedding or event industry. If you're just starting off, typically you're probably only focusing on the contract bucket, and just to a lesser extent the operations bucket. So that's a lot of what I handle, is contracts and helping people incorporate or understand how to create that, what we call the legal fiction of a liability covering business entity.
If in your advice, if someone comes to you and they are just starting off, they're that creative person that you just described, and they want to know their first step, it's like, I don't know what to do first, this whole thing, and you just mentioned all these buckets, right? Where should they start, in your opinion? Where is kind of pound for pound the best place that they can start to make sure that they're starting to fill some of these buckets?
So it's going to depend on what your industry is and like how hardcore you're moving forward. So somebody that has $1 million in capital and wants to start a wedding venue is going to be much different than a photographer that just graduated college or high school with $350 and a nice camera they got for Christmas. Their needs are going to be different, but typically the progression starts like this, like, okay, let's talk about how we can limit your liability in running this company. And that usually involves some type of incorporation, typically an LLC. And the reason why it's typically an LLC is because that is typically the cheaper component. It's the one that is most easy to operate. And like, well, Rob, why do we even need something like that anyway? And the reason is because we need to separate the owner of the business, you, from the liabilities of the business itself. So if you don't do that and you drop your camera on somebody's foot or you burn the church down, they're going to come after you and all of your stuff. They're going to take your Beanie Babies, they're going to take your Xbox, all that kind of stuff. So when you incorporate, when you have that LLC or the corporation, typically, depending on what you do, they're only going to be able to take the assets of that LLC. So that's why that's typically the first step. And as I mentioned, the LLC component, typically for what you're doing, is probably going to be it. Now, if you've got 5 partners that you're going in with, that's a different discussion. The next thing is going to be what the documents are the client signs, because typically you're not going to have employees, you're not going to have independent contractors, it's going to be you doing your thing. And so the next thing is having a client contract. What does the client sign in order to engage you to do whatever it is that you're going to do? Those are the 2 things. If you just woke up and are like, man, I'm going to start DJing, that's what I would say to do.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So it sounds like the last component of that, the relationship between yourself and the client, do you feel like that's where you see a lot of wedding pros kind of fail? Do you feel like there are a lot of, and I guess I'm talking about more when you are hired on by someone and someone does actually have a contract where you don't have to make the contract, but you're reviewing the contract to make sure it will, be useful to them in a situation. Do you find that there is incorrect language, or they don't understand? Maybe they just downloaded a contract from someone else and renamed some things. Like, what things are you commonly seeing wedding pros do as you're beginning a relationship with them?
Great question. So yes, I tend to find if somebody has stolen their contract from the internets, that there are going to be components of that contract that aren't relevant to what they're doing. And even if it is relevant to what they're doing, it might be overkill, or it might be whatever the opposite of overkill is. Maybe it's underkill.
Underkill.
So under not kill. So yes. So, but from a broad standpoint, the document that the client signs, and from, let me back up. So the reason why I said operations first in terms of shielding yourself in terms of liability in some way, whether it is an LLC, or if you don't want to do an LLC, you want to be a sole proprietor, then maybe get business insurance. The reason why is because that is the highest risk of ruin for you, for the least amount of effort to protect yourself from that amount of ruin. Okay. So that's why I say that. The next thing with the contract is, what is the most likely situation that's going to get you into trouble, and how do you protect from that? So 95%, and this is my anecdotal, like, I mean, this is not, I've done scientific studies on it, but 95% of the time somebody calls me, it's like, Rob, they didn't pay me, or they want the money back. Okay. So in short, 95% of the problems that I see with contracts or the operations of a company dealing with clients is money. So when I see people that steal things from the internet in terms of contracts, or, well, I borrowed it from my cousin's neighbor who met somebody at Baskin Robbins and that's how I got it, that doesn't deal with money. And if it's likely that the problem that you're going to see is money, then your contract needs to deal with money. And most of the times the stolen ones don't. So that's what I see. Then, like I said, there's other things where it's like, there's 16 pages of like indemnity that might not be necessary if you're not a wedding venue, for example. So I guess that's kind of the long answer to a short question. But yes, most of the time, what I would call the liquidated damages clause, what happens to the money if the event is canceled, isn't strong enough to suit the needs of an event professional.